This is the book Winchee, Mission Stories of Colin and Melva Winch by S Ross Goldstone. The true adventures of missionary pilots and nurses in the South Pacific, as retold to the children of Watertown SDA Church. I'm your storyteller, Austin Bacchus. Let's go! Our chapter this week is called The Call to Kukudu. Brother Winch, there's a call for you to the Western Solomon Islands to become the superintendent of the Amyas Memorial Hospital at Kukudu. Will you accept the appointment? Colin was jumping for joy. The many letters he had written to the Australasian Division Secretary, informing them of his yearning to be a medical missionary, had at last paid off. Not only was Colin now a registered nurse, he'd also been studying diesel engines and ship's navigation to prepare for a life of service in a mission field in the Pacific. But there was one problem. He was still a single man, and unmarried men were not accepted for mission service. In the meantime, Melva Franklin had never planned to marry. She had joined her sister in training as a nurse at the Sydney Sanitarium and Hospital. Now, at that hospital, Colin and his friends had developed a reputation as pranksters. Sometimes his escapades resulted in him being called before the faculty and disciplined. On one such occasion, the consequence was that he and Doug Ling were put on dishwashing duties. But both the young men were actually very grateful for this consequence because it gave them the opportunity to meet some of the lovely first-year nurses, one of whom was Melva. As the resulting friendship developed into courtship and eventually to talk of marriage, Melva became aware of Colin's commitment to mission service and gave him her full support. But Melva was not jumping for joy when Colin informed her of his call to Kukudu and that he must go as a married missionary. She had her heart set on finishing her final year of training to be a nurse. She was happy for Colin, but deeply disappointed at the prospect of not finishing her chosen course. Yet she said yes when Colin proposed to her in August 1955. They had discussed marriage prior to the call, but Melva had not anticipated it would come so early in her training. Colin was well aware of her turmoil, but he pointed out the opportunity that had come their way. He was to be the superintendent of a mission hospital. So Melva put aside her ambitions, and they were married by Pastor Wood in 1955. With excitement mounting, they made the final preparations for their departure. This included Colin doing some intensive training in anesthetics and dentistry, and Melva spending 6 weeks in the maternity ward at the SAN. Keen to learn as much as he could about every aspect of medicine, Colin took every opportunity to observe the skills of Dr. Tulloch the surgeon and Dr. Letham the anesthetist. One day, Colin was in the operating theater's observation gallery, and he was noticed by Dr. Letham. Knowing Colin had been appointed to the Amyas Hospital, he called out in a loud voice, "Hey, Winch, you better get down here and learn how to give an anesthetic." So never one to back down on an opportunity, Colin scrubbed up, put on a mask, boots, and gown, and presented himself at the operating table. Fortunately, the patient was drowsy from the preoperative medication, and he was unaware that a beginner was about to administer his anesthetics. But to Colin's great relief, everything went well, and the surgery was completed successfully. Extracting teeth was a major task for every medical missionary, so Colin was sent to the Sydney Dental Hospital to undergo a crash course in dentistry. Dressed in a white coat like all the other trainees, he spent a week observing experienced dentists going about their profession. Finally, he was given the task of extracting an elderly patient's tooth. Opening his mouth, the patient indicated the offending tooth. "This one?" Colin asked as he touched the tooth. There was no need of a reply. The tooth was so loose that it fell out as soon as he touched it. A successful extraction, but hardly adequate to prepare the young missionary for the days ahead. Finally, January 17, 1956 arrived, the day of their departure for Australia. It was a day of great excitement, particularly for Colin. Not only was he beginning a life of mission service, but he was to board a real aeroplane, something he'd always dreamed about. Melva reacted somewhat differently. She was leaving her family and friends behind with no guarantee she'd ever see them again. In those days, mission service was for life. This had been emphasized repeatedly by the church leaders. There was sadness mingled with apprehension about flying, apprehension about her inexperience as a midwife, apprehension about a new and strange culture, apprehension about not having access to shops. After all, she had never been taught to cook. How could she possibly cope without the necessary ingredients readily available? All of these thoughts and more flashed through her mind as they drove to the international airport in Sydney. Apprehension about flying and motion sickness was easily cared for. Melva took a motion sickness tablet, which cared for her so well that when the DC-6 airplane landed in Brisbane for refueling, they couldn't even wake her up, so the cabin crew left her on board to sleep it off. The new missionaries were soon introduced to the unexpected and bizarre happenings of their chosen vocation. While in transit, they spent a longer-than-planned stopover in a vacant mission house in Lae. It was well elevated with shower facilities at ground level. On going downstairs to have a shower, Melva was horrified to find toads jumping all over the place, including in the shower stall itself. It was a rude shock to such a new and innocent missionary, and an emotional challenge for Melva. But to Colin, it was one great adventure. Of course, such experiences became commonplace later in their years of service, but for the uninitiated, it was somewhat daunting. The 45-foot boat, Varivato, lay at anchor, waiting to take Colin and Melva to their post of duty. Painted white with green trim and sleek lines, the boat was a thing of splendor on that hot, humid, tropical morning. They were welcomed aboard by the native captain, Irwin Harvey, headmaster of the Kukudu School, and a tall, noble-looking Solomon Islander with a huge crop of tightly curly hair. His infectious smile revealed a set of shining white teeth. It was none other than Kata Rangoso himself. Floating on the deep waters of the Coral Sea, Colin could not help but marvel at the beauty of their surroundings. The captain set sail for Gizo. It was a glorious morning and a calm sea. Suddenly there was a cry from the bow. "Massa, he got some palapisi stop along boat. You come look him." Which meant, basically, "Come look, there's something along the side of the boat." Bottlenose dolphins were frolicking in the bow wave of the boat. Colin and Melva stood in the bow, holding onto the rail as they watched these marvelous creatures playing in the crystal clear water. Never having seen dolphins before, Colin and Melva felt as if they were in heaven. Be sure to tune in next time for more stories from the book Winchee by S Ross Goldstone, which is available at the Adventist Book Center. And meanwhile, check out these videos and others on my channel, with many more mission stories and Bible skits for kids and adults. God bless you.